It is your Friday daily delivery. I am Michael Rand. Glad to be back for another day. Hope everyone's doing well out there. Lots to get to on today's show. Sarah McLellan from the Star Tribune will join me here in just a few minutes to talk Wild. NHL draft starts tonight. Wild have the 13th overall pick. Our conversation will get into that a little bit, maybe what they're looking for to build on organizationally, depth-wise. We obviously know that NHL first-round picks, they don't usually make an immediate impact unless they're like the very best of the very best, and they might play right away. But whoever they pick tonight is going to be more of a, hey, they might contribute 2 or 3 years down the line, but what do they have to do this offseason, coming off a year where they didn't make the playoffs, one more year of the punitiveness of the Parisi and Suter buyouts this year? How can they kind of bridge that gap to 25-26 where that comes off the books? They can start acquiring some new players, things like that. What do they have to do this year to get back into that mix? Sarah and I will get into that in just a little bit. Got some USA Soccer takes at the end of the show. Not a great showing at all Thursday for the U.S. Just kind of a disaster all around. I'm talking about soccer here. Twins in a minute, Lynx in a minute. First, though, what I miss, got to wrap up the NBA draft, a 2-day affair this year. You heard Chris Hine and I talk about the draft, getting it set up a couple days ago. Talked about it quite a bit yesterday when the Wolves made a surprise move up the board to get Rob Dillingham from Kentucky at number 8 overall. The point guard of the future, you would think. Also took Terrence Shannon Jr. at 27. A couple guys who could be immediately in their rotation next season. Guys helping them get younger. Guys helping them play faster. Things of that nature. What I want to focus on just a little bit today, though, and I wrote about this a bit Thursday on the Randball blog, is how their approach to this draft kind of might reshape how teams go about building their rosters in the kind of new salary cap era. I know that's it's kind of a deep kind of inside basketball subject, but if you look at how rosters are constructed now, how the new collective bargaining agreement, which goes into effect, just in a matter of days here, how that impacts teams' ability to build around their star players. These teams that are all in the luxury tax, if you're in what they call the second apron, which is like a different level of the luxury tax, if you've hit a certain salary threshold, not just above the cap number, but above the first level of cap, going over the cap, you're in this tier called the second apron, which the Wolves are in right now, which very much restricts your ability to sign external free agents. You can't use the mid-level exception for for example, something that teams used to be able to use to kind of fill out their roster, get maybe a spot starter or your 7th or 8th man on the roster, a guy like Kyle Anderson, very useful players, guys that aren't necessarily going to be your stars, but are absolutely necessary as part of the glue for a playoff team and then eventually a championship contending team. So with teams limited in that regard, if you are in kind of that space, your best way to kind of retain players or add players is either re-signing your own free agents or adding through the draft. The Wolves right now in much better position to do the former, to sign their own players, because they've shed a little bit of salary. At least yesterday, they traded Wendell Moore Jr. To Detroit, offloaded a better draft pick. So you can see this was a clear salary dump. They traded their 37th pick and Wendell Moore Jr., a guard they took in the first round a couple years ago, got back the 53rd pick. So this was a clear salary dump. They're dumping salary. They're getting rid of a roster spot, opening up a roster spot, things like that to kind of create that space, create that need for guys that are going to be actually playing next season. Now they ended up trading those picks a couple more times. They don't know exactly what they're going to get, but I'm sure it's future second-round picks, things like that down the road, draft capital that they can use in future years perhaps to even bolster the roster even more. Now, here's the thing. They're not going to be able to do this every year, of course, because they don't have a lot of first-round picks left, right? They don't have a first-round pick next year. 2026, they've got one, but Utah has the right to swap if they want as part of the Gobert trade. They don't have one in 27. They do have one in 28. Don't have one in 29. Do have one in 30, but that is another pick swap as part of this latest trade for Dillingham with San Antonio. And they don't have their 31 pick. That's unprotected. And again, that was with That was with the Spurs in this latest trade for Rob Dillingham. So you're not going to be able to do this every year, but what they've done now is stockpile enough young players, enough draft picks this year, enough guys in the last few years that they believe in. A guy like Leonard Miller, a guy like Josh Minot, guys that are already on their roster right now that could play bigger roles in the future as they, as salaries go up, as some of their guys maybe leave in free agency, as they maybe trade some of their core, things like that. They've got these ready-made replacements, and right now they've got kind of this depth built out. So if you can't sign external free agents, they are kind of changing how you build your roster. You kind of have to go back to the draft, make it more valuable. And if you don't have a ton of picks right now, you have to figure out how to get picks right now. They creatively did that by trading a pick 7 years from now to get the number 8 pick in this year's draft, a guy who could help them immediately, who could be their point guard of the future if he's as good as they think he is. That's creative to me. That is setting yourself up to win in the present and the future, which you can't always say about the Timberwolves. Twins, meanwhile, bats are going strong right now. They won again in Arizona, got to the exact midpoint of this season with a 45-36 record. Obviously, that puts them on pace for 90 wins. That would be more than last year. Doing it more with offense this year, even after that tough start to the year, even after some rough patches of long losing streaks, they've emerged at the halfway point of the season with a pace for 90 wins, a pace to make the postseason again. Got to hand it to him. I think that's better than I thought they were going to be, especially after that 7-13 start. The offense has been better than I thought it would be. It's certainly gotten a lift from the return of Royce Lewis. How good Carlos Correa has been. It sounds like Correa maybe survived an injury scare in Thursday's game, got hit by a pitch on his wrist, but x-rays revealed no break. So hopefully he's back even as soon as today in the Twins lineup instead of having to miss some time there. David Festa made his Major League debut pitching for the Twins on Thursday, cruised through 3 innings, and then that dreaded second time through the order caught up to him, gave up 4 runs in the 4th, another run in the 5th, but he wins his debut, goes 5, gives up 5 runs. Need to see more from him in subsequent starts to know if he's ready to help right away or if he needs a little bit more seasoning, but some good stuff to take away from that start and definitely some more room for improvement. Biggest picture takeaway, though, is like the Twins, like I said, at the midpoint of the season, on pace for 90 wins. That is better than I thought they would be, and that is better maybe than they certainly looked at the start of this season. That's why we can't judge a team through 20 games. Got to wait for a little bit more of a sample size. Now, the Lynx, disappointing. Hangover after the Commissioner Cup win in New York a couple days ago. They lose to Dallas, which had been on a long losing streak, like an 11-game losing streak Dallas was on. Lynx, one of the best teams in the WNBA so far this year, came in, I believe, with a 13-3 record. They had won 7 in a row, including that win over New York in the Commissioner's Cup. They lose, give up 94 points. The defense failed them in this game. Hopefully just a blip, hopefully kind of, riding that emotional high of winning that Commissioner's Cup. Maybe the celebration got to him a little bit. Maybe, just took Dallas not seriously enough. Hopefully for them they can refocus because you don't want to see that become the start of a slide. That can be, can be the start of a slide when you have a bad result against a bad team that's on a losing streak. That can start something there. I don't think that's what this team is all about. I think this is probably just a blip on the radar, something that happens sometimes even to the good teams, but we will be watching and waiting to see on that as we go forward. Let's talk NHL draft with Sarah McLellan from the Star Tribune, covers the Wild, of course. We'll talk draft and other Wild stuff for the offseason as well. Sarah, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I am good. I'm curious to see not just, what the Wild are going to do with this first round pick Friday, but just kind of the general arc of where they are right now. NHL, obviously, this better than me and almost all the rest of us, but the player they pick, they're not going to get a lot of immediate benefit from, right? This is going to be a move for the future. So kind of in talking about this, I want to talk about kind of like general direction for where they're headed, but also maybe setting up some of the off-season stuff. But as you get a handle on the draft, Sarah, what do you imagine they might be looking for, especially in the first round?
Well, I think they're in a really unique position at number 13 because I feel like they're not in the top 10, but they're close enough where they could probably still really get, a key difference maker. And I think that's because this draft has a lot of unpredictability. We know who the consensus top pick is, Macklin Celebrini. That's been decided for a long time now.
Yeah.
But I think even, you can kind of maybe project the top three, the top five. But in what order, I think is still very much up in the air, from an outsider's perspective. And so I think that, obviously probably leads to a lot of different draft boards, across the league. And so someone that the Wild might have thought have been already picked by the time they get on the clock at number 13, could fall. I just think there could be, like I said, a lot of unpredictability. And I think that could suit a team like the Wild from where they're at, where, someone that they thought might have not been available will be. They're open, I think, too, to moving as well. To trading that, but talking to Team Brass and Judd Brackett, their director of amateur scouting, sounds like it's going to be very difficult to get into the top 10 because of that, because there's a lot of great options, and teams will probably end up with a player that they'd be very happy with, maybe even as a surprise. So I think that could really suit the Wild. And just, to see what's available. This is a draft, I think, compared to drafts in the past that has a lot of defensive talent, especially at the top, and just better defensive depth overall. So it'll be interesting to see if that's something the Wild, are able to acquire, because if you remember last year, they added a lot of centers, and that really addressed an organizational need, just kind of filling that pipeline in such a critical position that's so hard to acquire kind of in any other manner. For them, it's best player available too, but when it can also, check the box on a need, I think that's obviously a critical point for any franchise. But, for them, I don't think they see that glaring need that needs to be met. Just kind of maybe, seeing what happens in front of them. And if they end up with someone that maybe they thought wasn't available there, I think they're in, a kind of unique, interesting spot at 13 in the first round for sure.
It's got to be kind of tricky to draft for organizational need or depth when you don't know what this is going to look like in 2 or 3 years. A lot can happen in that time. But I suppose, like you said, last year, they knew that the center pipeline was thin, and that's been it's probably a problem in a lot of organizations. Finding good to great centers is difficult for anybody, but that's been something that has plagued the Wild to a degree for a long time, just not having enough kind of quality at that spot. So interesting you say like defense could kind of be a match both for the draft and for what they eventually need, even as we look at the roster and say Brock Faber, excellent rookie season, Calder candidate, things like that. You can't just have one. You got to have 6 to 10 good defensemen in this day and age.
And for some players, the position they play growing up isn't the position they'll play in the NHL. So that's what makes this also a challenge to kind of forecast where these players will end up, because someone who might be a winger or center now in their career could flip-flop and play a different forward position and go up the middle or go to the wing in the NHL. So it is tough to kind of handicap this and forecast where these players will land. I think that's why, especially like for the Wild, they really focus on hockey sense. And that's kind of maybe a nebulous sounding term. How do you quantify that? How do you measure that? It's not, the time of how fast someone skates up the ice, or it's not height or weight. But I think it's something that for them, when they see it, they can recognize it. It's maybe somewhat of an innate trait, but just having that awareness, having that ability to make a difference on a game and be a factor. And I think for them, they believe that's something that can translate. That's something that if someone's having that impact now where they can be a game changer, they have the smarts, they have the, they know where to be on the ice, they know and kind of have a really good feel for the action, that can project well for a career and future levels, going up the ranks, whether it's, the minor leagues or eventually obviously to the NHL. So I think it's looking at maybe some of those other attributes and not so much position, because you're right, so much can change, as can an NHL depth chart. And, holes that maybe exist on an NHL roster right now may not exist in a couple of years when some of these prospects are knocking on the door to make an NHL lineup. So it is very different and unique, especially compared to the other pro leagues, and the transition that those athletes make from the draft, whether it be the NFL or the NBA. Hockey, it does take a little bit while longer. And I think there then is a little bit more unpredictability in kind of forecasting the next wave of talent in the league.
When you started talking about that type of player, obviously this wasn't a draft pick, but this was a player. We just mentioned Brock Faber, a guy that they acquired in a trade. Like that's when you were talking about hockey sense, high hockey IQ, that's the kind of player I think of. And obviously he takes it to a big level and he's got plenty of talent as well. How are we seeing examples of other Bill Guerin draft picks yet that kind of fit that mold, or that you can see evidence of how they like to draft coming to fruition with some of the young players coming up in the pipeline?
Well, I think we saw just a few examples on the NHL roster last season, and I think right now maybe kind of, the poster boy for this is Marco Rossi. Him being someone who was a first round draft pick, 9th overall in 2020. So he's, it's been kind of about 4 years now. And he just finished his first full length year in the NHL, 20 goal scorer, someone who made an impact and stayed with the team the entire season. And it came after a summer where, he committed to being in Minnesota, training here, really putting the work in to stick with this team. You have him, you have Marat Kuznetsov, who, when he finally arrived from Russia earlier this year, he became a mainstay in the lineup, and I think started to showcase and preview a little bit of his two-way kind of 200-foot awareness game up the middle. Another key position, one of those, another center position that, was able to kind of come to fruition, make his NHL debut. Even more recently, like a Liam Ogren, that was only, a 4-game sample size for him. But to showcase, I think, the size, having the stature to kind of withstand the heaviness of the NHL, to already score his first NHL goal, factor in on someone else's goal. He's showing some of the tools that, the team probably anticipated him having. They've already kind of started to translate. So then you think to next season, getting a full season of work for some of these players. I think, that's kind of the blueprint right now is, seeing how it pays off. And again, that's, Kuznetsov and Rossi were, drafted multiple years ago. So it does take time, but I think they do have some real life concrete examples of this process working. And I think too, for the other young players in the organization, it's probably, motivating and inspiring to see that this can happen. We'll see if there's opportunity for new young players to crack the lineup next season. This is a roster right now that's almost at gridlock. A lot of players signed, but we've seen that this process can work even if it's stretched over, a few years.
It's interesting that the roster is so gridlocked because they're not a great team. They're an okay team. They've been, a playoff team for a lot of years, but then last year and dipped below that line. They were in contention, like kind of the fringes of contention to make the playoffs for most of last year, but couldn't really overcome that slow start and then that dip that happened right before Dean Evison got fired. But if you think about this year, it's kind of that weird spot if we kind of transition to not just the draft, but the off season as a whole, free agency, what they might look to do. Cap goes up a little bit. Maybe you can provide perspective on what that could mean for them. But just in general, they're kind of like in this space where they got that one more year of buyout penalties with Parisi and Suter still, where they got, almost $15 million in cap charges tied up in that. I'm sure they'd love to improve in other areas, but it's not like they have one glaring weakness. So how do they kind of go about retooling enough that they feel like they can be more than just a fringe playoff contender again this year?
Well, the cap did go up, and it actually went up more than it has in recent years. It went up $4.5 million. So the cap's going to be at $88 million. So that gives the Wild around $6 million to work with. And you're right, just on paper, the number of names signed, they don't have a lot of vacancies. When you look at even from their net out, both goaltenders are signed. We obviously saw Jesper Wallstedt and the push and maybe kind of the campaign he put together late to maybe kind of shake up the order and land a spot. We'll see if they decide to make any changes with their goaltending. But even looking, on defense, 5 players are signed, so that's almost filled, and they have a restricted free agent in Declan Chisholm. And at forward, of the players that, played at least part of last season, 12 forwards are signed.
Yeah.
Their restricted free agent up front is Mason Shaw. So there's not, on paper, like I said, you look there, it doesn't look like there's a lot of need, but obviously when you look at performance, improvement needs to be made to obviously bridge the gap to being a playoff team. I think for them, a big priority this summer will be in finding a way, if they are going to add, whether it be trade market or free agency, in finding players that have the identity that this team wants to get back to playing. And that's being hard to play against. It's having the size. I think particularly up front. We kind of saw it. They didn't really kind of look like themselves up the past few years when they were making the playoffs. When they looked, maybe even a couple of years ago, primed maybe for a longer run. I think that's been kind of their reputation, and something they take pride in is that they've been usually a tough matchup, and they've been a handful. And they got away from that. And so I think adding that size, that grit up front is something that can maybe help them get back to that, improving their depth too. We saw the toll that injuries took on this roster and this lineup last season. And that's a factor, right? We can't ignore that helps explain why this team struggled and why, probably had the coaching change and didn't make the playoffs ultimately. Individual performance, having that be better, that's one way to remedy that. Stay healthier, obviously, but improving the depth too, just so that if they do get in that situation again where they are tested, where they have to shuffle their lineup, having better reinforcements, being able to step in and provide that lift. I think that's a big key right now, league wide too. We always talk about, is this a copycat league, and what are the teams winning, doing that other teams will try to mimic? I think depth right now is probably really trendy right now in the NHL, because you can see the teams that went far in the playoffs, they had contributions throughout their lineup. Obviously, some of the game's best superstars were still playing in a Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final, but the players that were still contributing to help those teams get there were third and fourth liners at times. So I think improving that also is an opportunity for them. Like we said, they have a little bit of money to spend. Obviously, they have some of their own players to acknowledge and figure out. I think with trades, they're in a position where they could not. I think it's kind of a wait and see situation. I know for Bill Guerin, it's a situation right now where he's taking and making phone calls, but he doesn't have to do anything. So maybe in some sense, this is kind of a discretionary summer for the Wild in trying to, like I said, bridge that gap. What change can they make? But ultimately, what change will they make to try to show that this is a team that needs to be better if getting back to the playoffs is realistic in another year's time?
Well, I'm glad you brought up Bill Guerin. Our colleague Lavelli Neal III wrote about the Wild earlier this week, kind of setting up what's at stake this offseason, not just the draft, but just in general, of kind of how you get better without all that flexibility. Again, still with the Suter and Parisi buyouts. Basically, Guerin saying, he's not going to settle. He's not in a position where he's just going to like punt on a year, because that's not how he's wired. And that's kind of how Lavelle set up this quote. I want to read it for you. He said, "You're right. I'm not wired that way. I don't have that in my DNA. And I think we can get better than we were last year. We can add to our team, but we also need to be better as individuals and as a team, but we can add." And I think that speaks to a lot of what you just said, but also I read that as thinking Bill Guerin, what seems like he was a little disappointed with what they got out of the roster last year. Maybe a GM's always going to feel that way if things go bad. It wasn't my fault. I gave you the team. I gave you the guys, and you didn't get it done. But how do you read that? Is that just him saying, "I think we can be better this year"? Do you think he was disappointed in how last year went? How do you read that quote?
You're right. I think there is potential for this group to get better. And there's a couple of reasons why. I think one is, like you mentioned, probably individual performance, players rebounding. Maybe it's a case where, like a Marcus Foligno, who was hurt, just gets healthy and stays healthy and is able to get back to kind of being really that two-way force that he's been for the Wild, that he really wasn't able to be this past season because he was injured. rebounding, like, a Freddie Gaudreau bouncing back offensively. I think there's instances of that where personally players can just, maybe they're not going to be at the career high level that a lot of them were at a couple of years ago, but still, show more of that production. I think too, another factor is John Hines and the fact that he'll be here from the beginning.
Yeah.
So we kind of saw how they played under him, under his system, from end of November on out. And you're right, it was a team that came close. That was kind of a fringe in that playoff race, and had a few games gone, the other direction, they may have, made it to the playoffs as a wild card team potentially, right? So him from the beginning, from training camp, it'll be interesting to see if they're able to really utilize and exude that style that really seemed to click for them in their turnaround from the beginning, and avoid the slow start, because that's, obviously what was really tough for them to overcome last season. And I think in today's NHL, it's just too competitive that it's very, very difficult to rebound. Now, we saw Edmonton do that, obviously, from being near the bottom of the standings. So it's not impossible, but it's maybe not always realistic for that to happen. So I think those are some of, reasons why this team just as is could rebound. But still, him saying we can add, or there are options. We talked about that. They have resources. They could explore a trade and just create more flexibility that way. They totally could. And I don't think anyone would be surprised because of Guerin's mantra and because of the way and the style that he's led this team. This is still very much a win now organization, no matter, what the standings showed last season, maybe where they are in their life cycle with the buyouts. Players are wired to win too. They're showing up every day with that goal in mind. Free agency as well. There's going to be some change. Is it enough with the combination of players rebounding, a full year of John Hines, staying healthy, which obviously is very difficult to control, but can that equal an equation that gets the Wild back into the playoffs? We'll see. But I think there's a way to see that as a possible outcome.
Yeah. Well, and this is a league that changes fast. Like you said, like Florida, a long maligned franchise, they win a Stanley Cup. Paul Fenton hoists the Stanley Cup, the former Wild general manager. He's there, I think now he's part of the Florida brass. Like, just because something happens at one point doesn't mean that's how it's always going to be. And to me, though, this offseason, correct me, I want to get your sense of this, but to me, the goaltending is kind of the biggest lever they can decide to pull or not to pull. Like whether they decide that Wallstead is ready and that they're going to make a move with Gustafsson, or however they want to play it. That feels like to me like the biggest question for them to ponder, and something they don't have to do anything about, but that they could do something about if they felt like they wanted to free up either money or roster spot or things like that.
It might also be the most intriguing too, just because that is such a big catalyst for team success is goaltending.
Yeah.
So, what you have in Marc-Andre Fleury coming back for his last NHL season.
We think.
So, and then, for Gustafsson, it was a dip from his previous performance with the Wild, a year earlier. So now you kind of have this crossroads with him. You kind of have a tale of two seasons. And, which is the goalie that is going to prevail? Who is, the goalie of the future? And then, with Wallstead, I think he showed the way he was able to rebound from his NHL debut that, he might be aging out of the AHL. He might be ready for this opportunity.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think, across the league, there isn't, the need to rush anybody, especially goaltending. It's such a difficult position to translate through the ranks. If he went back and continued, to play well there, maybe even dominate,
yeah.
I don't think anyone would be critical of that decision right now. But it's fascinating. And you're right. I think that might be kind of the decision that sets the tone, because it might give them some more flexibility, obviously, if they were able to move a Gustafsson contract and promote then obviously a Wallstead. But two, just like I said, the tone that your goaltending sets, we saw what a Fleury Gustafsson tandem can do, these last few seasons. what would a Fleury Wallstead, partnership duo look like? Obviously it's unpredictable, but I think just for this team that has, year by year really been built out from its net and taking care of its own zone, and to play the way that John Hines wants to play, quick up ice, quick transition, get out of your zone, funnel pucks the other direction. That's key. That's key to the on ice product. Forget about the books, forget about the money. That's really going to set the tone. So you're right. I think that's probably the biggest, most interesting question facing the Wild. It's a question that they could answer by doing nothing, right? Yeah. So that'll be interesting because they could do nothing. They could change it. And we'll just have to wait and see, for what ultimately happens.
Fleury Wallstead would have to be the biggest age gap between two goalies in the NHL, right? Like, what are they talking about? Like 17?
Experience wins, totally.
Yes. Yeah, that would be something if that ended up being it. But Gustafsson still under contract, still here, and we can't forget. Like 2 years ago, he was great. Like he was dynamite. He was good enough that he was their playoff goalie and played pretty well in those playoffs, even if they lost. So big decisions across the board. The first one they have to make, obviously, is at the draft. Although that, like we've said, won't have a huge bearing on the 2024-25 season, but does have a big impact on future organizational depth and possibilities for down the road. Sarah McLellan, appreciate you joining me. Follow Sarah's coverage from the draft, and Sarah, we'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Great stuff from Sarah, as usual. One postscript that we did not know when we recorded. Brock Faber finishes as runner-up in the Calder Trophy race. Not a huge surprise there. Connor Bedard, even after missing some time last year, was the odds-on favorite, but Faber had an unbelievable rookie season, should be primed for a great Wild career, but finishes as runner-up. Loved his outfit, by the way, at the awards ceremony. Had the turtleneck kind of look, mock turtleneck almost underneath the suit. Good look for Brock Faber and a great season for him. Looking forward to seeing what he has coming up this upcoming year. Let's finish with the cooler, and not a great one if you are a fan of U.S. soccer. I happened to watch quite a bit of this game. Tim Weah sent off early, red card, punching a Panama player, just kind of away from the ball, just an inexcusable loss of composure. U.S. actually scored a man down to go up 1-0, but could not withstand playing with 10 men for most of the match. They lose 2-1. They are in danger of not making it to the knockout stage in the Copa America. So big one against Uruguay coming up for the U.S. We will see if they can rebound from this one and go forward. I don't know. That was a tough one to watch. They just did not have enough firepower and did not have enough composure in that game. Maybe they can turn it around, like I said, in their next match. That will do it for me today. Like I said, lots of good stuff coming up next week. And if you missed the bonus episode from the Star Tribune All Metro Sports Awards, go back and listen to that. Fun interview with Luca Garza in addition to Mark Dolo Harris. Yeah, go back and listen to that. That went live Thursday evening. Until Monday with Royce, I am Michael Rand. Back at it then.